This week on Engage the Sage.
Hi everyone, I'm Don Saucier. Welcome to this week's episode of Engage the Sage. This week we're going to tackle the question about whether or not you should apply to graduate school. It's the time of year where if you're going to apply to graduate school, you probably want to get those letters of recommendation set up, start to figure out the programs you're applying to, start to think about what you're going to do with the rest of your life. For many of you, though, this is kind of an existential question that's causing you some anxiety. And what we're going to do today is, in terms of answering the question, should you apply to graduate school? Well, I can't answer that question for you. This is a question you have to answer for yourself. And what we're going to do is we're going to provide you some questions you should ask yourself to help you decide about whether or not you should apply to graduate school. The first question that I'm going to recommend that you consider in deciding whether or not you should apply to graduate school is asking yourself, why am I applying to graduate school? I want you to think about what this motivation is. Are you doing it for you? Because if you're not doing it for you, if you're doing it because someone else expects you to, maybe a parent, a significant other, maybe a mentor that you have, if you're doing it for them, it's probably not the best reason. I'm going to recommend that you only apply to graduate school if you're doing it for you. Now, it might be that applying to graduate school is something that you need to do to accomplish your professional goals. That's awesome. But I think that you should be clear about that in the application process. And they're probably going to ask you that if you have an interview for graduate school. The second question I want you to consider about whether you want to apply to graduate school or not is, can you afford to apply to graduate school? Attending graduate school is not cheap. Applying to graduate school is not cheap. Most places when you apply, you're going to have to pay an application fee. So those costs are going to add up kind of quickly. Also, when you go to graduate school, even if you have an assistantship, and you might not have a research assistantship or a teaching assistantship, depending on what kind of program you're applying to, even if you have an assistantship, you are not going to be well compensated. So you want to think about whether or not you can actually live if you go to graduate school. Now, it may be the case that you decide you do want to go and it's going to be expensive. Then you want to think about your options. You want to think about funding options that school may have. You might find, for instance, that a PhD program is going to have more funding options than a master's degree program, but the PhD program is going to be much more competitive and take longer. So you want to kind of think about what your options are. You want to think about whether or not you can maintain your current job or if you'll have to get a new one. And you want to think about all those costs of moving to a different area, living in that area, and those kinds of things. So there's going to be a lot of math that goes into figuring out whether or not you can afford to go to graduate school. You'll also want to consider, when we're thinking about cost, about whether or not you're going to have to take out loans. And you want to think about what your expected salary is going to be when you finish graduate school. So you want to think about, if I incur all of these expenses, am I going to have a job, an occupation that compensates me well enough that my investment is going to be worth the return? The third question I want you to consider when deciding whether or not to apply to graduate school is, how is this going to help you toward your career goals? Now, what this means is you have to figure out what your career goals are. You're going to want them to be somewhat specific and somewhat realistic. If you don't have career goals that are consistent with needing to go to graduate school, then maybe you don't go to graduate school, because you should not go to graduate school just to delay all of those decisions about what you want to be when you grow up. It shouldn't be just the next thing that you do. It should be done with intention. Now, you may decide that what you want to do for a career requires an advanced degree. So you need to go to graduate school, law school, medical school, vet school, whatever. That's great. But if you find out that the activities you actually want to perform in your career don't require you to go to graduate school, then maybe you don't have to. So being very, very informed about what it is that you want to do, and then making sure that a graduate education is what you need to do that, is something that you should explore before applying. The next question I want you to consider in deciding whether or not to apply to graduate school is, consider, what are your application restrictions? Now, what I mean by application restrictions are those deal breakers, those kind of non-negotiable things that are going to lead you to be able to go to a program or not. These might be job responsibilities. These might be family responsibilities. They may be geographic restrictions. They may be financial limitations. But thinking about, where is it realistic and plausible that you might be able to go? Being upfront and honest with yourself at this point and deciding, you know what, I can't leave this region of the country because I can't be that far from my family. Deciding that now is going to save you a lot of anxiety later. Now, you do have to be aware that any restriction that you set is going to narrow the pool of available graduate programs to you. So, for instance, when I was growing up in New England and I decided I didn't want to leave New England, well, there's a lot of schools in New England. So that is something that I could do without restricting myself too much. But if you're in Kansas and you decide I can only go to graduate school in Kansas, there may be only a handful of programs or even less that would be options for you. It's also going to be beneficial to you, and you maybe save some money in applications if you only apply to graduate schools that you would go to if you got in. If you apply somewhere that you think you probably would not go to, even if you got in, probably not a good idea to apply to that one. The fifth question I want you to consider when thinking about whether or not you want to apply to graduate school is think about, can I get in to graduate school? Now here, you're going to want to take a long and honest look, and you might want to involve a mentor as part of this conversation too. And throughout this entire process, you should be working with a mentor who's going to provide you some insights about this entire process. But you're going to want to think, am I a competitive applicant for the programs that I'm applying to? Deciding where to apply for graduate school is going to be different than those decisions you made for applying to undergraduate programs, because graduate programs are typically much more competitive than undergraduate programs. It might be the case for a PhD program, for instance, they might be only accepting one or a couple students, for instance, for that program that year. Some years they might not be able to accept any students to that program. And this is something you might want to check in to see if they're accepting students that year. But you're going to want to be realistic about whether or not you would be a competitive applicant for the programs you apply to. Now, check out some of our previous videos. We've provided some insights about getting letters of recommendation, writing personal statements, those kind of things. But there's generally about 5 things that are going to be evaluated when you apply to graduate school. The 5-ish things that are generally evaluated when you apply to graduate school are going to be your undergraduate grade point average, any standardized test scores that school is going to require, your personal statement, your letters of recommendation. You want to have at least 3 strong ones, and then any experience that's going to be relevant. So maybe internship experience, clinical experience, research experience, relevant job experience, or volunteer experience. Before you apply to programs, you want to take that objective look to see, do you have a chance to get into that program? If not, then your application fee is a donation to their graduate college. The 6th question I want you to ask yourself if you're thinking about applying to graduate school is, am I prepared to go to graduate school and succeed? If you are committed to applying to graduate school, then you're committing yourself to taking on graduate school level responsibilities. These responsibilities, the specific things that you do and those expectations are going to vary program to program. But in general, these are going to be markedly more intense than what you experienced in your undergraduate education. I highly recommend that as you're starting to think about applying to graduate school, talk to your mentors about what their graduate school experience was. Try to talk to people who have been to graduate school in other ways, maybe even people who are at that graduate program now. Maybe you can reach out and ask to talk to some of their current graduate students in the application process. But you also may want to find someone who is doing the career that you want, interview them, maybe even shadow them to find out if this is something you really want to do. Because if you are applying to graduate school because of a preconception or a stereotype about what that really is, you might want to test the accuracy of that conception before you commit yourself to doing that. You also want to consider, do you have the skill sets that are going to make you successful for graduate school? So if you're applying to a clinical program, do you have internship experience or volunteer experience that are going to help you build some of those clinical skills? If there's a research component, do you have research lab experience? Have you designed studies? Have you collected and analyzed data? Have you presented at a conference? Have you co-authored a manuscript? You want to think about, do you have the skill sets that will allow you to succeed? If not, graduate school is going to be harder. My purpose in asking you these questions today is not to deter you from graduate school, but I want you to be aware about what you're getting into. I enjoyed graduate school. It was a great choice for me. It really helped propel me toward my professional goals. But I've also seen a lot of people go to graduate school and it not be what they expected or what they ended up wanting. So I want you to think now realistically. Is applying for graduate school the right decision for you at this time? If the answer is yes, work with a mentor, write your personal statement, get those letters of recommendation, go to graduate school and thrive. But if it's not, that might be a good decision not to apply. Throughout this entire process, I've mentioned this a couple times, but I want to make sure you remember it. Work with a mentor who can provide you with objective information, input, and feedback. to let you know their thoughts and then use their thoughts as informative for answering the question for yourself. In the comments below, I would love to hear any additional questions that you have for us about whether or not you should apply for graduate school. Now, to be honest, we'll probably answer with more questions, but that'll be fun. Thank you for watching this episode of Engage the Sage. Please like, subscribe, sign up for notifications, share us on social media, and we'll see you next time on Engage the Sage.